recently a video went viral online depicting what has been described as the heinous and horrific racial profiling and mistreatment of two young men in a Starbucks in Philadelphia. According to the reports I've seen, these two black men walked into this Starbucks in Philly, asked to use the restroom, which apparently uses a door code, and then hung around for somewhere between 15 to 25 minutes while supposedly waiting for a friend, according to their account. They were told that the bathroom was for paying customers only, but rather than spending $1.50 or whatever outrageous amount Barstucks charges for a small, tall plain coffee or an iced tea, the men chose not to patronize the shop, which, at least to me, either means that the urge for them to go wasn't overly insane, or that they just had no intention to buy anything from the cafe, whether their friend was there or not. Now, one thing that most Starbucks do provide is free Wi-Fi access, which, potentially, I would say these lads were utilizing during their wait. But hey, I can't say for sure. But given they didn't purchase anything and continued to loiter, potentially taking advantage of some of that free Wi-Fi access, at some point the men were asked to leave the premises. After about 15 minutes, the manager, who refers quite politely to the two guys as gentlemen in her 911 call, calmly explains her rationale while talking to the police.
I have two gentlemen at my cafe that are refusing to make a purchase or leave.
When the police did arrive, they spent several minutes speaking, as far as I can tell, quite calmly to the gentlemen.
Two gentlemen, especially what is amazed is I was able to take a really, really hard, long penis into my vagina, as well as my, what do you call that, rectum.
Who continued to refuse to leave peacefully. I admit, I cannot make out the precise words being exchanged here, but my guess is that the men were given multiple occasions to vacate and again chose not to. This guess is backed up by an official statement from the Philly Police Commissioner, who stated that the officers asked these men 3 times to leave, despite various white, surely progressive patrons of the liberal hotbed Starbucks voicing their incensed concern towards the cops over the fact that two black men, being treated politely, were asked to leave. Yeah, they had to do just that. They had to put them in handcuffs and escort them away because they refused to leave after being asked 3 times.
They then approached the males. They asked the males to leave because they're being asked to leave by Starbucks employees. In fact, in an effort to quell the situation, officers actually called for a supervisor so that it would not get out of hand, something that was a good decision. And 3 different occasions, the officers asked the males politely to leave the location because they were being asked to leave by employees because they were trespassing. Instead, the males continued to refuse, as they had told the employees previously, and they told the officers that they were not leaving. When the call was initially made, the Starbucks employees had told the males that they were going to call police, and they said, go ahead and call police, we don't care.
And I should point out that one of the police officers who arrested the men himself was black. But the interesting stuff in this event isn't the event itself, which was non-violent and frankly milquetoast, with the majority of the ire during said event coming not from the staff, not from the police, not even from the men themselves, but rather from these white patrons. As far as I can tell, again, from the evidence that I see presented in these various viral videos, nothing really interesting happened. These men were peacefully escorted away. The only people who even got mad were the white patrons of the Starbucks. Despite the fact that the 2 men were promptly released after being taken into custody by the cops as Starbucks chose to press no charges, this video of course has sparked national outrage as being definitive evidence of vile, implicit racial biases belonging even to the likely liberal Starbucks employees, and as further and questionable proof of the rampant racism and violence inherent in the police system.
Now we see the violence inherent in the system. Shut up! Oh. Come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
As of the writing of this video, the protests and boycotts continue, despite the fact that the manager who called the police was fired essentially overnight. But, of course, merely firing the manager alone served as no balm on the wound of racism that cuts through the nation with this repugnant act, and the protests rage on, with people screeching through megaphones at minimum wage employees, unrelated entirely to the incident, and crying continually for the firing of the manager who was fired on the spot.
We want the manager fired that called the actual cops, right?
She's been moved from the store.
We heard that, but we want her fired. Or we want her gone.
The manager was doing her job, and was completely within her rights, likely trying to do her job as correctly and accurately as possible by reporting these two men who were asked to leave after loitering and trespassing and refusing to pay for services. So let's look at the laws involved here, right? While a business can make rules such as no shirt, no shoes, no service, the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes it illegal for any business of public accommodation, such as a cafe like Starbucks, to deny service to any individual based on their race, color, religion, or national origin. This was expanded upon by the Americans with Disabilities Act and various state and local legislature laws that prevent discrimination based on, for example, sexual orientation. Obviously, the outrage here is because the manager violated this law. Well, did she? It seems that the men were given ample opportunity to patronize the shop, but chose not to. Given the men were asked to purchase a product, by definition, they were not denied service, they were offered service. When they were denied access to a private bathroom, which is restricted by use of store policy to patrons, well, maybe that violates it in some way? Not really. It's a private bathroom for patrons. And why is their bathroom private? Why does it have a code on the door? My guess is it would have something to do with the fact that crime in the city of Philadelphia is the highest of any city of its size in the nation, and has forced the operators to restrict access. Again, I see no evidence that these men were denied any services. What this means is that we have left behind entirely the realm of discrimination under the Civil Rights Act, and we have entered instead the realm of loitering and trespassing on private property. Now, loitering is a highly variable thing based on local legislation, jurisdiction, and the decision of the business owners and managers to do things such as press charges, such as was in this case not what Starbucks chose to do. Loitering, simply put, is defined as to linger in a public place without purpose, while trespassing is knowingly entering another person's property without permission. And while this didn't begin as trespassing, after being asked repeatedly to leave, calmly, it did enter that realm. Most of the time, businesses have little problem with loitering, so long as the loiterers are peaceful and quiet. I've certainly done my share of what could be considered loitering, as probably most of us have at one time and another for some reason or another. The problem arises in that the men were asked to leave, refused. At that point, really, it was up to the manager to make the call of whether or not the men were loitering or trespassing in her cafe, and to ask the police to remove them from the private establishment. As I mentioned, loitering is a contentious kind of legal term that is highly dependent on any number of variables, including jurisdiction, context, length of time spent loitering, etc., and typically carries few if any repercussions, although trespassing can have some serious implications. But again, this was not the case in the two men who were arrested because they were immediately released after being processed. It mostly just serves as a manner through which business owners can potentially have disruptive people who refuse to leave removed by the police. Now, we don't know if these men were being loud or disruptive, although some of the other cafe goers claim that they didn't do nothing, and I'm not actually disinclined to believe them. Although, goddamn, there is some interesting evidence that white liberals will tolerate shit from black people that they would find reprehensible for whites. I know this is a tangent, but look at this study I found the other day in my research on humor that indicates that white liberals find conservative black comedians hilarious, despite hating the exact same content from a white comedian. Sorry, tangent again. The point is we don't know what happened leading up to this instance, given there have been reports that they were being disruptive, reports that they weren't being disruptive, they were calm and polite, claims that they were being indignant to the employees, even encouraging them to call the cops, and so on and so forth. But none of that is really of import, now is it? The fact is they were asked to make a purchase and leave, and they essentially told the staff to piss off. I do what I want.
Oh yeah? I run with 12 gangs, and we only commit hate crimes. I'll do what I want.
As far as I'm concerned, that's grounds for calling the cops. It's a private business. They were given every opportunity to make a purchase, and they refused. Now that's what I call loitering. And again, don't just take my word for it. The Philadelphia Police Commissioner agrees that the officers in no way acted inappropriately in this instance.
It is important to emphasize and underscore that these officers had legal standing to make this arrest. Again, they were called to the scene because employees said they were trespassing.
You say,
maybe.
The manager only called the cops because she's simply a racist, and the police, even the black cop. But in, you say, maybe. The manager only called the cops because she's secretly a racist, and the police, even the black cop, only arrested those guys because they're racist too. Yeah, he's got some implicit self-loathing, that black cop. And all the whiteys, well, we all know they totally hate blacks. If you think that, well, you'd be right in line with the thinking of Starbucks corporate, which not only, again, promptly fired the manager, but had the CEO meet with the two men who were arrested, and now have announced that 8,000 stores will be closed on May 29th for an entire business day to engage in racial bias education and training of 175,000 corporate employees. And whoo, lad, that's the aspect of this story that really got my noggin jogging. While I certainly find this picture that, well, so wholly illustrates the supposed privilege so many leftists are so preoccupied with, as a man who has the free time, money, and energy to take a day off of work, presuming he does work, to protest through a megaphone indoors and scream at a minimum wage, likely part-time employee.
Part-time.
Why did they use that take? You know, the worst one?
Neck deep in college loans about shit completely outside of his control or influence, as hilarious an exemplar of the backwards and pointless nature of the so-called progressive stack when it reduces individuals to one demographic difference. Nah, the shit that made me sit down and write this is the fact that Starbucks is so inundated with white guilt over this shit that they are willing to lose millions of dollars potentially. Flush more money than you and I would ever even be able to dream of down their private bathroom toilet in a vain attempt at signaling their virtuosity. Yeah, that's the thing I found fucking interesting, and I find that interesting because it is truly a waste of money and time. So today, I'm going to explain exactly why it is. Let's talk about implicit racial biases in police and in businesses, and the effects of racial bias training designed to reduce racism in the workplace. To begin, let's describe what an implicit bias is. Simply put, even most progressive liberals will probably admit that most people aren't overtly racist, but rather that they hold deep-seated beliefs or associations that cause them to treat people of different races differently, with greater or lesser respect, fear, trust, etc. The last couple days, every time I've gotten on Twitter, for example, I have about 500 notifications because there's a group of fucking commies who cannot stop talking about me because they think that I have implicitly dog-whistled to Nazis, and even though I've never denied the Holocaust or said gas all the Jews, I'm an implicit Nazi. It's just under the surface. You know, you don't have to make any kind of definitive claims or prove anything if you can claim it's all implicit. It's going on behind the scenes. Oh wait, never mind. Forget implicit. Kevin Logan just outright called me a fucking Holocaust denier.
It's between 4 and 6 million. Like, what does it matter? Is people are, like, it's hard to count how many million. And Aiden was just
because it's lowering the number. That's the point.
No, it's not. How is it lowering the number?
And I, by the way, didn't even lower the number. All I said was the numbers were contentious. It could be higher. It could be lower. The fact of the matter is that during wartime, the Nazis didn't keep track record of this. This is the whole point. This was not the purpose of my video. Then can you find, Kevin, any information that contradicts what I said, which is that the numbers are contentious? Can you find any information that proves definitively?
No, because like so many
number of people died in the Holocaust. Can you find that?
So many of your fellow propagandists, you've kept it vague enough that you can cover your ass. And on that note, I'm going now, and fuck you.
Oh, what a very convenient goodbye your head. But it's not without any basis in reality in terms of what implicit biases are. They do exist. How do we know they exist? Well, through something called the implicit associations test, which typically flashes images or words in quick succession and measures how quickly participants respond to these stimuli in any various number of ways to determine any extant biases in processing. The basic IAT measure looks at bias by asking participants to select the word good or bad in response to seeing an image of a person's face, and has found pretty consistently that white people tend to prefer the faces of white people, to associate white faces with the good response to the stimulus. Now, the findings from black participants have been a little bit mixed. While some studies have found that black people also tend to respond more positively to white faces, other studies have found that they respond more positively to black faces. See Livingston 2002, which found despite explicitly stated in-group preferences for other African Americans, meaning that when asked, black people say, yes, I prefer to be around other black people, that implicit preferences were erratic. Sometimes they had more preferences for black faces, sometimes they had more preferences for white faces. Well, why might that be? Let's think about what this is a test of, this quick processing is actually measuring. The IAT is assessing the connections between what are called cognitive heuristics. Those are mental shortcuts, and we all have them, and we all utilize them in order to make quick, split-second decisions. Given that we are cognitive misers, that is that we want to conserve as much mental energy as possible, pretty much at all times, we develop these close mental connections between concepts, between neural nodes, so that we can make these split-second decisions very quickly. See McCrae, Milne, and Bodenhausen 1994 for an overview. From an evolutionary standpoint, heuristics serve to protect us from danger, such as our general aversion as a species toward not only snakes and spiders, but anything that we see out of the corner of our eye that might look like the shape of a snake or a spider coming towards us. We react in a fight, flight, fear response. Quick reaction. You can think about heuristics like a series of pathways which become more or less worn down over time between these associations in our minds. Some associations aren't used very frequently, so the road is really just slightly worn down grass, while others are used over and over again, and that just slightly padded grass goes down until it becomes a dirt road with more and more increased traffic, and until that little dirt road becomes a full-on highway of information. In terms of associations, well, most of us have positive associations with our families, who generally are the same race as us, or mixed race. Thus, that might explain why we have faster associations of good with those who look more similarly to us. Now there's likely also a genetic component that causes us to prefer those kin who look more like us than those who look more dissimilar to us. But again, this is why heuristics exist, so that I can very quickly and immediately determine if an approaching person is part of my tribe, is part of my kin, or if they are part of a potentially opposing tribe, if they are not part of my kin. These associations are just most closely connected, that's why we respond very quickly. And actually, it may also explain why we find these conflicting reports in implicit associations tests from African Americans, and before no dad jokes, but other Black Americans in explicit questioning. Black people represent a significant minority in the United States, and thus are very likely used to seeing white faces in what might actually be the media effect of cultivation, but more likely is just an effect of being a minority. If you're a minority, yes, you're going to see lots of positive white faces probably, even if you don't like whitey outright, you're still going to have some implicit associations. And that really is all the implicit test is, though. It's instantaneous, precognitive response to stimuli. And what does it appear this training from Starbucks is intended to alter? Well, just that. The implicit, non-conscious biases that we all have, and by the way, we always will have, because again, this is a function of evolution. But hey, they think they can change it, so let's take a look at how implicit biases manifest in behavior so we can see just how awful these implicit associations really are. So, of the outcomes of implicit biases, one possibility is what's called misattribution, such as described above of quickly processing blacks as bad and whites as good. But again, this seems likely based off the strength of associations due to upbringing, exposure, and possibly genetics. Surely there must be some racist shit in there though, Aiden, right? Well, yeah. As Correll, Hudson, Guillermo, and Ma 2014 found in an extensive overview of research on the topic, they reported that participants who were told to select a dangerous suspect to shoot responded more immediately to an armed black person, while they were faster to choose not to shoot an armed white person. In other words, people were in fact faster to shoot a black person who was armed with a weapon than a white person, even if the white person was armed. Let's consider again the purpose of heuristics though. They exist to help us make split-second decisions in order to defend ourselves. And the sheer facts alone indicate that young black males commit the vast majority of violent crime in the US from a purely safety-oriented and statistical standpoint. By that I mean this. African Americans comprise, again, 13% of the population and generally commit about 50% of murders and robberies. Thus, from a pure safety-oriented outlook, both white and black people, as was indicated, likely have a pretty rational reason for responding more quickly to shoot an armed black person than an armed white person, based solely on extant statistical evidence. Again, you could make the argument that some of this is media exposure. This is a cultivation effect that makes everyone think blacks are more violent. But the facts are the facts. The statistics are the statistics. Thus, if we're working out of just self-preservation mode, it makes sense why you would be more distrustful of the armed black man than the armed white man. I'm not giving a value judgment on this behavior. I'm just saying it's logical from a self-preservation stance. Again, it could be a media cultivation effect. It could be an effect of poverty. But there's also just the reality effect, I guess. Interestingly enough, this effect was not replicated in police officers in that study. Officers who were trained in reducing biases were actually more prone to shoot white people than black people immediately after the training was administered, as were students who completed a similar virtual task. But these tests only assessed the short-term effects of training with responses over the course of 24 hours. Further, these results about this diversity training efficacy were only present in beat cops. They had no effect on more experienced special unit officers. You know, the guys who've been out there more, who are more familiar with high crime areas, and who have a hell of a lot more field experience. In other words, cops with more established cognitive heuristics and associations were completely, pretty much unaffected by any attempts at retraining them. Well, then there you go, right? Cops are racist against black people. That's why we need this re-education training. Here's the thing. We do see sometimes that these programs aren't complete wastes. As I've shown in part above, maybe they do work even if they then switch the attributions in the opposite direction, but maybe they do work. And if they do work, in what instances? Well, Pettigrew and Trop 2006, in a meta-analysis of 515 studies on the intergroup contact hypothesis, which was first posited by Allport in 1954, found that yes, mere exposure to people from an outgroup does tend to reduce prejudice, and that programs designed to expose individuals to one another can enhance this positive effect of intergroup communication. That's the mere exposure effect, and it's similarly found in, for example, romantic relationships. I kind of always think of Jim and Pam in The Office, particularly towards the later seasons, because it seems that maybe they don't have that much in common. They just sit next to each other, and they sit next to each other for so long that they fall in love. Maybe they weren't actually soulmates, they weren't actually so suited for each other, but rather they spent so much time together that their relationship became comfortable.
Shalom. I'd like to apply for a loan.
That's nice, Dwight.
Or, I don't know, here Data describes it in terms I feel a bit more comfortable with myself.
Even among humans, friendship is sometimes less an emotional response and more a sense of familiarity.
So you can become used to someone.
Exactly. As I experience certain sensory input patterns, my mental pathways become accustomed to them. The input is eventually anticipated and even missed when absent.
But this mostly tends to apply to groups of individuals who have had prior exposure to one another, that have few of those cognitive heuristics upon which to base their associations. Again, yes, long-term exposure to outside groups can lead to positive results, to reduction in prejudice, but the data are fairly consistent that it is just that. Long-term and exposure that are most meaningful, not short-term attempts at reducing bias and rerouting these very well-formed cognitive heuristics through a day of training. And the research on that is fairly consistent. Lai et al. 2016, in an analysis of 17 intervention and training programs with 17,021 participants, found that across all programs designed to reduce prejudicial processing, the effects tended to dissipate after a 24-hour period, across all 17 programs. While initially after training, respondents seemingly reduced their stereotypical thinking, testing merely a day later indicated a return to pre-established heuristics. If you know anything about these training programs, in order to pass, in other words, in order to keep your job, at the end of the program, you had to take a little test. Well, of course, you want to answer that test to keep your job. In this case, though, even when it was just a laboratory experiment, it didn't really matter. After 24 hours, it went away. Spencer, Charbonneau, and Glasser 2016, in an overview of research on policing and implicit bias, note that rarely, if ever, are long-term testing of the efficacy of these training programs ever conducted. Basically what happens is you finish the day of training, you take a little test, you get your certificate of approval, and they never fucking ask you about it again.
And then take your mother, Dorothy Mantooth, out for a nice
bias training exercise.
And never call her again.
But we do see some short-term effects, right? So maybe it's not completely pointless. It is completely pointless, but just research for research's sake then, why might it be that these programs appear to have some effects on certain populations, but not more experienced, or if you want to call them, black-pilled motherfuckers? Well, it may just be, astoundingly, that personal differences in intent matter when attempting to change behavior. Shocking, isn't it? Gonçalo Correll, 2011, found what appears to be the most important factor in finding out whether or not people engage in less stereotypical processing over time. Because again, although generally they dissipate, they don't always. We do find that, again, long-term exposure has a positive effect. These 24-hour programs don't, but the long-term exposure does. And there's a moderator factor there. It's intent. The orientation of one's motivation to comply. That is, people who are intrinsically motivated to be less, quote, racist were less likely to associate guns in the Gonçalo Correll study with black people than those who were only extrinsically motivated. That is, people who are being told by their boss to engage in some pointless fucking program. In other words, when forced into training and without any internal desire to reduce prejudicial beliefs, training was completely pointless. This finding was also supported by Lai et al. 2016, who similarly found that high self-motivation was a potential moderating factor in any possible long-term outcomes of these programs. Thus, why do we find some effects in non-experienced cops, but not in experienced cops? Well, because the experienced cops, they know the extent to which their lives are in danger, and are well aware of the frequency and statistics of crime, at least from their historical interactions, if not from the actual crime statistics, although I would suspect they're familiar with both. Even under those conditions, with heuristic associations that would make police more suspicious of black or Latino young males than, say, white or East Asian women as being potential dangerous threats, we still don't even see the kind of bias processing from these trained professionals in the way in which organizations like Black Lives Matter frequently claim are endemic. For example, Correll and Schroff 2016 conducted an analysis of stop and frisk practices in New York City, and found that while, yes, most stop and frisk procedures produced no illegally possessed firearms, when the researchers controlled for district in which the practices were conducted, the racial differences in stop and frisk seemingly disappeared. What I mean by that is that these neighborhoods in which these stops were conducted were the highest in crime in the city, but also were predominantly comprised of African American and Latino populations. You can't pull them apart. They're the highest crime, they also have this population. While the cops were far more likely to stop and frisk black and Latino suspects, most of which again revealed no illegal weaponry, meaning it was a waste of time, technically, these stops were also largely conducted in the most violent areas, which again happened to have more black and Latino citizenry. Thus, the argument that cops are just simply racist is tenuous at best, given there's no real way to separate whether these stops were occurring more because of the high crime nature of the precinct or because of the high minority population of the precinct. Again, this is correlational data, and if you want to say, well, the crime is only higher there because it's also lower in socioeconomic status, I wouldn't automatically dismiss that argument. But that's not the question being discussed here. The question is, do the police unfairly target black people? Well, when you account for violent crime neighborhoods, no, they don't appear to, at least not in the case of New York City. In this instance, we know that despite the seemingly nice neighborhood that the Philly Starbucks resides in, that Philadelphia is the most violent city with a population of over 1 million in the United States by percentage, and that this particular institution had had enough problems to the point where the owners deigned to place a coded lock on their restroom. Thus, we might expect the Philly City Police to be a little bit more, not so much racist, but a bit more vigilant in a more positively valenced verbiage, or more anxious, more negatively so, in a city like Philadelphia than in one like, say, Tulsa. There's just more crime. But Aiden, we've seen time and time again that the cops just love shooting black people. They're so quick to pull the trigger. Well, let's actually look at the data. We saw earlier that immediately after training, less experienced beat cop officers actually gained greater proclivity towards shooting a white man with a gun than a black man. But we also saw that the more experienced officers remained prone to shoot an armed black man first, regardless of any attempt at diversity training. Heuristics, statistics, and crime areas be damned, these cops are just fucking racist anyway, right? Except, it seems that in more realistic combat scenarios, in studies that don't just test how quickly you associate an image of a gun with a person of either race, something that a little bit more accurately describes actual police work, that might still not be the case. James and Villa, 2016, found that an analysis of 80 police officers when put into realistic semi-virtual reality simulation of an active crime scene, so they had one of those, House of the Dead style setups with an HD TV and were asked to respond. Again, very dissimilar from the more simplistic implicit associations test we find in most of these research, of black equals gun or black plus gun equals shoot. The researchers found that while, yes, consistent with the extant data, the officers expressed more implicit bias biases in associating a black person with a firearm. In the simulation itself, in contrast, the officers actually took significantly longer to shoot an armed black suspect, and were 3 times less likely to shoot an unarmed black suspect than an unarmed white suspect. Yeah, you heard that correctly, but just in case, because I know it's a little bit jarring, let me say it again. Cops were much more hesitant to fire upon an armed black suspect, and were significantly more likely to fire an error on an unarmed white suspect in this experiment. And while of course it is a simulation, it illustrates that even when implicit biases are present, as they were here, they are not determinants of behavior. And that in these more simplistic experiments that just test how quickly you can respond to something, that doesn't actually have anything to do with real police work, with being out in the field and choosing whether or not to utilize your firearm in a potentially life and death situation. These are disparate. And to rely so heavily upon the implicit associations test is an error. These cognitive heuristics are shortcuts. They are just quick little snap judgments, but they don't have much to do with how we truly behave when we have more than a second to process information. Even for the police, who often are in these deadly scenarios where they really do only have a second to process the information, or else potentially lose their lives or the lives of one of their fellow officers. And it gets worse. It may actually be that some forms of these diversity programs, which already are rarely assessed for their long-term effectiveness, could actually have some negative effects as well, even if only in the short term. As I've hopefully made evident, cognitive heuristics are the result of worn associations between concepts, and cannot be so easily rewritten through a 12-hour training course. But as we saw with the police who were more likely to target whites, it may be that other types of training similarly increase prejudicial thinking by further activating different pathways. For example, Garonsky, Deutsch, Mroku, Sate, and Strack, 2008 found that when participants were told explicitly to associate oppositional words to a stereotype, they actually responded with more stereotypical thoughts. That is, participants were asked to respond with a resounding no when looking at a stereotype that was congruous with typical stereotypes about men or women, meaning that in response to women, when shown a word such as weak or fragile, they were asked to respond no. In an attempt to retrain the cognitive heuristics, to make them go in the opposite direction and have the rivers run backwards, I suppose, to negatively associate woman with words like weak or fragile. Those participants, though, in that condition, they actually relied more heavily on stereotype thinking after engaging in the training. A similar result was forwarded in a second study that assessed preference for whites or blacks, and while there was reduced stereotype thinking and preferencing in the opposing condition that used affirmative statements to say yes in response to a stereotype that didn't make sense or is not typically associated, so to say yes when you see woman and then the words strong or masculine, right? Participants in that condition did have some reduced stereotype processing, but in the negatively balanced processing, it was increased. The takeaway from a study like this is that the results of these diversity training things, short-lived as they likely are highly vulnerable to error and to valence, such that some types of training may actually increase the supposed racist-type thinking that they're designed to ameliorate. Lie et al. 2016's analysis also confirmed that the most effective programs were the ones that avoided all negative or positive associations, but rather focused on self-involvement or intrinsic motivation, rather than shaming or emotional valence of no or yes. The things that are going to work, I think we described them kind of early on. It's long-term exposure, and it's wanting to change something about your mind. Well, Aiden, you've mostly been talking about the police. What about the racist manager who clearly deserved to get the boot? Probably along with, all the other employees who surely have some implicit negative associations towards black people. And even though we've shown pretty definitively, I think, that implicit associations don't really mean jack shit. Well, it must be there's systemic racism across all Starbucks employees, and hence why there's a need for nearly 200,000 of them to spend a day being re-educated in programs that, as we've seen, don't appear to have any long-term lasting effect. Except, no, again, the findings are pretty much exactly the same in the business sector as they are in any other. Khalif, Dobbin, and Kelly, 2006, conducted an analysis of 708 businesses that were subject to federally instituted diversity education programs, evaluation, and mentoring practices between the years of 1971 and 2002, and found that despite all these attempts, white women, as well as both black men and black women, continued to lag behind white and Asian men in managerial positions. Well, can't be that these programs just don't work. No. Institutional racism, right? Despite the fact that, they legally can't discriminate. Again, going back to the Civil Rights Act. Not legally. And despite the large amounts of money that the government has poured into these programs, well, a second study, conducted slightly more recently by Dobbin, Kim, and Kali of 2011, found, not only consistent trends with the first, but provided implications that might explain said trends. And guess what? It was just as we found in the previous research covered here, that it was intrinsic motivation that matters more when it comes to reducing so-called prejudice when looking at the number of women in managerial positions. Not entrained and enforced from the outside, but from within the corporate culture. The greatest increase in minority and women managers occurred in sectors where there was already an emphasis on diversity within the individual organization. In other words, a company like Starbucks that prides itself on being diverse, inclusive, and liberal, it's out of fucking Seattle for fuck's sake, is probably one of the last places on Earth that could benefit from any pointless diversity training, given it is already ingrained in the corporate culture. Starbucks has a black female COO. And yes, of course, she was quick to want to meet with the two men who were arrested in this instance, because she was just so offended, because that's the corporate culture. It already is in place there. Of course, these are just trends, but given we've seen the very fleeting effects of diversity training indicating that it's very unlikely that this would have any long-term effect in any company, it's probably even less likely to have any kind of effect in a corporation with an environment like Starbucks. It is essentially preaching to its own choir. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Oh, everyone is racist, everything is hopeless, can't we ever get along? No, look, that's fucking dumb. As Allport found in his seminal research on exposure, when groups interact over time, there comes to be less animosity towards one another, as the meta-analysis of research on contact theory has also confirmed. And even though people do tend to self-segregate, if they spend time around each other for long enough, they come to become, comfortable with one another. Not always, just on average, because there's some people you're always just going to fucking hate. But it seems pretty consistent that the only way to really reduce any potentially damaging biases we may have towards people of another race or towards another race at large is going to come through this contact effect. Moreover, it has to come from within, through a reworking of the cognitive pathways, and it has to come naturally. Enforced diversity training is not only fleeting, it potentially forwards the opposite of the intended effect by increasing prejudicial thinking. Usually, again, temporarily. But regardless, the findings seem consistent in that change cannot originate externally, but rather have to come from within the self, be it through exposure, or through a sincere desire to change one's own beliefs and behaviors, really working hard at it. In other words, here's the point. Diversity training doesn't work. It's a waste of everyone's time and money. It might have a couple of temporary effects, but any effect that it has, long-term, is going to be self-imposed, or a result of long-term exposure. The only thing that you get out of this is being able to say, look, a bunch of our employees got an A+ on their diversity training test. But guess what? If you retest them tomorrow, you ain't gonna find that A+ anymore. While there may be some emerging research that illustrates, for example, long-term effects can be incurred through Pavlovian-type associations between stimuli during sleep, as Who et al. 2015 found by using sound waves, I am skeptical of the practicality of these findings in training programs, in their long-term use and application. Regardless, closing 8,000 stores, wasting the day of tens of thousands of employees, losing millions of dollars to impose a training program designed to reduce implicit racial biases is thereby nothing short of pissing money away, and will do nothing to somehow make these employees, who are already within a company with a female, black COO that has a corporate culture directed towards more female managerial hiring and mentorship, somehow less, quote, racist. The only possible outcome I can see from this financially pants-on-head virtue signaling is going to originate from 4chan shitposts encouraging, mostly trolls, a number of absolute dicks like this motherfucker.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
All right, I heard y'all was racist, so I came to get my free coffee.
I saw that.
Yeah, I heard you guys don't like black people, so I wanted to get my Starbucks reparations voucher. What's that?
Is that a real thing?
It's a real thing.
I mean, I'll give it to you. I saw that on my Twitter last night. I was like,
yeah, I need a free coffee.
I'll give you a free coffee.
And maybe if few legitimately gullible black people to go into some random Starbucks with these faux coupons demanding free drinks. And given how they've now scared their employees shitless with fear of termination for doing their job, being racist, it's going to end up costing them another pretty penny or two. In fact, it's already fucking happening. And holy shit, wouldn't you know it, that as I was finishing up editing this video, I actually found something even more heinous. It's this. This guy who has now quit his job at Starbucks because he couldn't take the number of people that were coming in and asking for free drinks. Basically desecrating his place of employ, and all of it coming out of his pocket because corporate doesn't have the balls to say no to these fake coupons that have been made by fucking 4chan.
That if we're presented with one of these fake coupons, to just go ahead and honor it and try to avoid any type of future, situation. Yesterday, one of my partners received a phone call from a guy saying that he and his squad were on their way to my location for their free coffee, and that they would be recording the entire thing so that they could put it on WorldStar or social media or YouTube or Facebook or wherever, and proceeded to call her a white bitch. We immediately just asked them what they wanted. Yeah, sure. What would you like? And they all three wanted just iced caramel macchiatos. So we made them. We made their drinks. We gave them to them free of charge. They left. After that, the barista had rung it up. And we just put in our 30% discount and paid for it out of pocket. I did. Another customer has come in and asked that we change the music to something more like Kendrick Lamar. I've had homeless people come in asking to use the restroom, which we've let them, of course. We've been told to, and we have. And one of them or someone, I don't know who it was, of course, ended up just pissing all over the bathroom.
To note Vox Day, as I so very rarely want to do, SJWs always double down. No amount of prostrating will make Black Lives Matter and white, guilt-ridden liberals stop publicly denigrating Starbucks. But within a month, trust me, they'll be right back to ordering their daily source of soy.
It is a single bag venti with awake tea with 3 inches of steamed soy and foam, 3 raw sugars, and then you add later 3 spun nuts and vanilla powder. 1 bag. If afternoon, it's summer, then I do a venti decaf soy, sugar-free, caramel frappuccino light, with extra drizzle and easy whip. Must be the drizzle, not the syrup. And if it's afternoon and fall or winter, then I do a single bag coffee in a venti cup with 3 raw sugars, 3 inches of steamed soy and foam, and then topped off with 3 spun nuts and vanilla powder.
Thus, the company is really flushing cash and their employees' time for no reason whatsoever. Within a month, all of these outraged individuals will have moved on to the next thing. You have accomplished nothing. Nothing about this will change anyone's minds. Neither the employees, nor the typical screeching protesters who will continue the charade until they get bored and moved on to the next source of outrage. It is all a pointless waste of everyone's time and money, and frankly, fuck you, Starbucks. You fucking suck. Your coffee tastes like burnt assholes. So see if I care when you burn your money. My only irritation with you is explicitly in what was surely the irritation mirrored by your employees being subject to this pointless training. And it is pointless, as I have illustrated in detail. And any implication to the contrary is pure idiocy, as we have seen, and as we always will see, because you cannot change others, you can only change yourself. And even then, probably not very much. We're animals of habit, yes. But most of all, we're animals who act in defense of our own survival and self-preservation, which is what the fuck a cognitive heuristic is. Which is what explains the differences in implicit associations testing, which is why your shitty, baseless, non-empirically supported attempts at diversity training will never work, have never worked. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.